Hi, everyone. I'm Paul. I'm a performance architect, and I want to talk about fonts today. Fonts are one of those things that I think every single one of us use like on an everyday basis, and it's really just at its core used to style text, right? So like I can change the slide to be a Times New Roman slide, or a Times New Roman font, or a Comic Sans font. Beyond, this is still just a fixed set of characters. In fact, it's just 16 characters that spells out font performance. The font is really just used to style that text, right? And today's talk is really about the performance impact of hosting fonts or serving fonts with your web pages, especially when it comes to custom web fonts. Now, regardless of whether you use a font on your site, you're still using fonts. So in this very basic example, like a Hello World style example, there's no font, but you're really using a default font. So this is a default system font. If we style this with a font, so in this case we're styling it with the sans serif fonts, the text appears different. It's still the same amount of bytes in the HTML, or similar amount of bytes, because I've changed the text a little bit, but it's styled differently. Now this is almost kind of free in a performance perspective because this is using a system font. It's a font that's actually loaded onto the device, and you didn't have to do anything extra for it.
A little louder.
Louder?
If you can do it a little louder.
Okay.
Sorry, we don't have a mic.
Now, if we take another, so when we talk about custom web fonts, a custom web font could be a font that you've designed, that you've had designed for you, that you load from a third party. In this case, this is an example of a third-party custom web font that's being loaded from Google Fonts. So you can see that there's a link. There's a link element here with a CSS file loaded from Google Fonts for an Open Sans font. The font family says Open Sans, and there's a fallback font for sans serif. And there is a performance cost for doing this, right? So if we look at this in terms of like a web page test measurement, you can see that the base HTML in this case was 248 bytes, right? So this was really, really, really small, and it was very fast. It loaded in 150 milliseconds. Most of that was network time. There was a CSS file that got loaded, and that's what we had linked in the head, and that was 2 kilobytes. But it went out to a third-party domain, so it went out to had to be a DNS lookup, a TCP connection, and a TLS handshake to go to fonts.googleapis.com. Then there was a font file that got downloaded, and so this is an 18 kilobyte font file. It was loaded from another domain, so DNS lookup, TCP connection, TLS handshake, and the domain and the download for the font request. All in all, this added 20 kilobytes of data to this page, and it took 4 times longer to download to render the page because of the custom web font. And this is a very primitive example, so fonts, I'm not saying fonts are going to make your site 4 times slower, but you can see that like in this like really, really lightweight example, fonts do actually kind of, have an impact. I was chatting with one of my colleagues about this talk and how I was going to talk about fonts and just kind of dive deep into like a variety of different metrics around fonts. And it kind of surprised me because I didn't realize that someone actually made a video game inside of a font file. And like I feel like I'm going to lose half the audience here now because I'm going to show the URL, but it's like a Pokemon-style video game, right? And it's actually just one font file, right? It is a 258 kilobyte font file that has a video game inside of it. And they're actually doing a lot of like performance best practices. They're caching it. You can see there's a max age of 10 minutes. They are gzip compressing it because it's an OTF font and that isn't compressed by default. They're serving it via a CDN. I can see that there's a Fastly request ID. So they're actually doing a lot of best practices for font delivery. But the one thing that I thought was really interesting about just the 258 kilobytes for a video game, which is about the size of like an old legacy Nintendo game, is that over 20% of websites are using more than this to style their text, right? And so, and this stat actually comes from the HTTP archive, which we'll talk about in a little bit, where we can learn a lot about just kind of the state of the web from the HTTP archive. this is actually a graph showing adoption of custom web fonts. So web fonts haven't always been as prevalent as they are today. Right now, they're used by about 85% or 84% of websites. 10 years ago, it was less than a quarter of websites. So the majority of websites are using fonts today, and the vast majority of them. And it's not just popular sites. It's not just sites with large budgets. You can get a font for free. You can go on Google Fonts and download a font for free and have it on your website. If you're using a CMS, chances are it has support for fonts. So websites, regardless of rank and regardless of popularity, are using fonts. Another thing that's really important to consider is that fonts download very early in a page load. So 85% of websites, or 85% of the top million websites, are actually loading at least one web font before the largest contentful paint. And depending on the amount of fonts that they load, that could be a significant impact on largest contentful paint. This isn't really a surprising stat because fonts are a high priority resource. This chart is kind of a busy chart, but it is the request priorities in Chrome. So what this shows you is how the Chrome browser is actually prioritizing loading content. So the highest of the high resources in that far left corner is the main document, and then the early CSS that's referenced in the head. Fonts are also in there as well. So if you have a font and then JavaScripts or images, those fonts are going to take priority over that from a network perspective. Now, all of the stats that I was just showing you and a lot of the examples I'm going to go through actually come from the HTTP archive. So the HTTP archive is an open source repository that tracks how the web is built. This is a collection of about 18 million websites. Every month, there's a web page test measurement that is run for desktop and emulated mobile. And the data is stored, and it's stored in BigQuery. So we can actually go and query that data, and we can learn from that data. We can look for different aspects of the web and really kind of do a lot of research. On the httparchive.org website, there's a bunch of monthly trends. There's a discussion forum, and there's also a link to the Web Almanac. The Web Almanac is a community-sourced ebook. So this is we skipped last year, but there's going to be a 2024 edition. But it's basically the previous year was I think 116 contributors from across the web community came together to do analysis with the HTTP archive, and it's a pretty thick book, but it's all available for free online. So you can actually go and research like a variety of different topics, whether it's fonts or images or CDN and so forth. And there's an entire chapter on fonts, and it is a long chapter. This goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to go into in this talk, and it's definitely worth a read. If you're interested in querying the HTTP archive, there's a website called har.fyi that actually documents how the HTTP archive format is structured. It's all the JSON files from web page test that gets loaded into BigQuery, and we can run SQL queries against that. And this contains some getting started guides and examples on how to do that. My experience with the HTTP archive is someone often will ask me a question, and I'll be like, ooh, what did I have to do? I'm going to go and start focusing on this problem because it's so interesting. And so I'm very, very often nerd sniped. It's actually happened a couple of weeks ago with fonts. A performance engineer, Josh Appel, had written on LinkedIn that he found a website that had 73 fonts on it. He said almost 4 megabytes compressed. Right, there's more weight in fonts than all other MIME types combined. And so someone else had commented on this and said, I wonder if they're trying to set a world record for the number of fonts. And so that was like immediate nerd snipe. I was like, I need to go and find out who has the most fonts. And it was like some paragliding website, right? But I actually found 729 fonts. Well, they're Google fonts that were loaded on a page. This here is actually the waterfall, right? That's a lot of fonts, but when I looked at this, I also found 3,000 other websites that made the same mistake. And what I think has probably happened is someone wrote a guide on how to integrate Google fonts, and it was probably setting people down a wrong path. And now you've got 3,000 examples of very poorly configured Google fonts out there, and that's kind of how this happens sometimes. For a lot of other sites, like you might see like kind of things creep up where maybe like you add another font and another font and another font, and suddenly you have a lot of fonts. A good way to kind of keep on top of that is perf budgets, so performance budgets. Performance budgets is kind of like a financial budget. Like you have a fixed amount to spend and you want to kind of stay within your bounds. And performance budgets gives you kind of is a framework in which you can say like, this is how much I think I should be, loading on my site, and then track it with either synthetic measurements or real user measurements to try to determine like, am I within these bounds or am I creeping outside of the bounds? This blog post was written by Tammy Everts. She's at SpeedCurve. She's the Chief Product Officer for SpeedCurve, and she's done a ton of work around perf budgets. SpeedCurve actually has first-class support for perf budgets in its product. And we actually wound up implementing a pilot of this at Etsy with SpeedCurve as well. And one of the things that is like really important is like when you're doing perf budgets, like it's going to be boring, right? Like you should strive for it to be boring, right? Because you want there to be like nothing changing, right? Like you want to stay under that budget threshold, but sometimes it looks like this, right? Sometimes it's like, wait, something went awry. Like what happened? And like this like up and down pattern here, like when I saw that, I was like, I wonder what's going on. And this was an example that happened for last summer at Etsy. And what I had found was that we were running an experiment. So we were running a multivariate experiment. This was the top left is the control. And then we were running an experiment where we had two different like promotional sections on the website with different layouts. This is what the waterfall graph looked like. Now, if you've in web page tests, the darker shade of content actually shows you the amount of bytes transferred over the network. So when you see like these when you see these bars that have a lot more like dark shade in them, it means that there was more bytes being transferred. And in this case, you can see on line 12, there was 134 kilobytes in a font file that we had added on our homepage. And when I looked at this, I realized, so this was a thin-IT. This was a thin italic font. And I used some techniques that we'll go into in a little while to identify that it was really just styling these characters. So these characters were costing us 134 kilobytes, right? An image would actually be smaller. And what I wound up doing was I used a technique that we'll talk a little bit about called font subsetting. So this font that we had a lot more characters than we needed. And so we wound up subsetting it by just reducing it to Latin characters. And by doing that, I was able to actually shrink that to 60 kilobytes. Now, this was also a licensed font, so we needed to go and reach out to the font vendor and make sure, like, could we actually do this? And the font vendor was actually like, yeah, you can do this. Oh, and by the way, here's an even smaller file, right? So, like, don't be afraid to, like, if you have these large files and you want to subset them and you're not sure if you can, reach out to your font vendor, or if you have a license to manipulate them, do it yourself. But you can definitely reduce the size of these and kind of offset some of the performance, some of the performance cost of adding new fonts. This actually led me down a path of like creating a tool, because I'd started like once with web performance, really with anything, once you start noticing the problems, you can't like unsee them, right? And it's like, oh, here's another site that's doing this. Here's another site that's doing this. And so I wound up creating this tool called Web Font Analyzer. Now, Web Page Test has a ton of information in it, and not all of it actually makes it into the user interface. So there's a ton of information about fonts in Web Page Test that actually doesn't surface. So I created a tool that basically you throw a Web Page Test measurement in there, and it will actually give you some insight beyond what Web Page Test shows you, but using Web Page Test data. It's kind of a lazy way of building a tool. Like I didn't actually have to do any processing. I just download a JSON file and extract the data. But in this case, I created this UI of saying so Etsy's got a page weight of 2.76 megabytes. This is for the homepage. There's 88 kilobytes of fonts. I actually parsed the rendered HTML and was able to extract that there's 108 visible glyphs on the page. A glyph would be like a character. And there's a little button here that says show glyphs. So I kind of created this like periodic table where And what it is like you've got the glyph, you've got the code point, or like an ASCII code, but this is the numeric version of the ASCII code. And then the number of occurrences. So like, if you ever want to win like a bar, like a trivia question, E is the most popular character on our homepage apparently. But like when I look at this, I can see that there's not a whole lot of characters beyond like the Latin extended range. Like there's a couple of characters for like different languages, and like probably the language drop downs, but there's not a whole lot beyond that. I also created this visualization that shows where fonts are loading, right? And I broke it down into time ranges. So what happens before the first contentful paint, what happens between the first contentful paint and largest contentful paints, and what happens after the largest contentful paints. And what I was able to see is that all of my fonts on Etsy are loading after the largest contentful paint. If they were all loading before the first contentful paint, and there was a lot of them, I'd be a little bit, concerned about optimizing that, because I know that like those are really high priority resources, and they would probably be impacting that render time. I also created this section here that shows you the a summary of the fonts that are used on the page, as well as how they're loaded. Right, so we're using font display swap, which is a performance technique that allows you to render the text first in the system font, and then swap the styled font into place after the font's loaded. Right, which is why for us we were able to render the content on the page before we actually loaded the font. And I can also see in this section over here the size of the fonts: 32 kilobytes, 28 kilobytes, and the number of glyphs. Now 554 characters or glyphs seems like a lot when we only have 108 characters on the homepage, or 108 glyphs on the homepage. But it's also important to note that so Etsy is because a lot of the content on Etsy is user generated, right? Like our sellers upload their content. It could be in different languages, so we need to be able to support that. But so I'm not too concerned about this because the file sizes are small. But that 134 kilobyte font used to style promotional contents, that needed to be reduced. There's a bunch of font loading strategies for web performance, and this has been talked about in all the books that Sergey shared with you, and so a lot of conference talks. So I'm not going to actually go and repeat all of this. But this is just a really high level summary, right? You want to reduce your font sizes. You want to use less fonts. You want to cache your fonts on the CDN and the browser. You want to try to avoid third-party fonts. You want to load important fonts early, and you want to load non-important fonts later, right? And if you want to learn about more about these, there's some really great articles on font optimization. In fact, the first one here from Zach Leatherman is actually, I think the title of it is like an unhealthy obsession with web fonts, and it is fantastic. It's like a link to all of his greatest hits on fonts. I've actually learned more about fonts from Zach's blog posts than about just about anything else. So definitely this is an entire talk condensed into one slide. But what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a bunch of examples of websites that could benefit from some optimizations. And so these are real websites. Some of them you might visit on a regular basis. Some of them you might be familiar with. But these are all examples I found out of the HTTP archive. And just like the example I showed you with Etsy, this is really just to kind of learn from examples, because I can give you a whole bunch of best practices. But if I can give you a bunch of examples where you've seen the patterns, then chances are that when you see it again on your site, or if you go and analyze your site later and look at it, you'll be like, oh wow, we have this issue, we should try to address it. So there's a bunch of different font formats, right? There's WAF2, there's WAF, there's TTF, there's EOT, there's OTF. WAF2 is supported on all modern browsers, and it is the smallest font file that you're going to get. It is a Brotli encoded font file. Use it, right? It's the only browser that doesn't support it is IE11, and you really shouldn't be serving content to IE11 anyway. So I wouldn't worry too much about IE11. Let them get the fallback font. When I look in the HTTP archive, I can see that 83% of fonts that are loaded, this is across all of the 18.5 million websites, 83% are using WAF2. So WAF2 is really, really well adopted. 11% are using WAF. If you're among the 11% that are serving WAF files, you can probably save about 25 to 40% in byte sizes just by switching to WAF2. There's a couple of other font files that are used, like TTF is very commonly used for icons, and OTF as well. TTF is true type fonts. Those are TTF, OTF, and ET and EOT are not actually compressed in the binary themselves. So you need to apply compression via the content encoding. So like the same way that you would gzip compress JavaScript or HTML, you need to do that for TTF fonts. WAF and WAF2 are already compressed by default. And when we're talking about font compression, so this is an example of a website. I think this is Bath and Body Works. If you look at this font, like the amount of like shaded content in these like waterfall bars shows you that there's a lot of content being downloaded. But this font was 243 kilobytes. When I looked at, so there's a tool that I wrote called Compression Tester, which is where I can take a font file. I could take a file, and any file, whether it's JavaScript, HTML, and I can actually go and apply different compression levels against it. And so I wound up taking this file, and I applied every level of gzip and Brotli to this. Right. At gzip level 6, I was able to reduce this file from 243 kilobytes to 106 kilobytes. There's a whole bunch of font files. I think there's 3 font files here. Altogether, if I compress each of these font files, I can actually reduce the font weight by 43%. This is using Fastly. They can easily turn on compression in Fastly, and poof, the site's faster. Another one is all the glyphs, right? Like we saw in the example with Etsy that we were using 500 something glyphs. There's the same example here. This site has 1,972 glyphs, right? Looking at the tool that I wrote, there's 78 visible glyphs on the page, right? So, and all of these are Latin characters except for this copyright symbol. So we could actually create a subset of that original font package and see how much we can reduce it by. So I wound up taking that font package and I ran this command called peyft subset. And there's a link at the end of this for like where you can get the tool. But I wound up taking the source file, modified it to a WAF2, took the Unicode ranges of the Latin text characters and the copyright symbol, and I added the trademark symbol in there for good measure. Outputted it to a WAF2 file, and I got a file that was 8 kilobytes. Right, that is a huge reduction of that. And like when you're looking at a waterfall graph like that, like having a lot of font content being downloaded, like that means that those higher priority font resources is actually interrupting or taking away bandwidth from other resources. So being able to compress this, even if you don't need the font right away, and in this case the font wasn't needed right away, it still would help the images load faster because something that's blocking the images might be able to load faster. Another example is on Kia's website. So if you look at the my little periodic table here of glyphs that are used on the Kia website, you'll notice that there is an N with a tilde on top of it, and then there's two Korean symbols. Those Korean symbols next to each other just spell Korean, and it's actually used for the drop down in the in this list here, right? But this particular website is loading 15,190 glyphs. Right, so they're loading a 1 megabyte font file, but they're loading 3 1 megabyte font files. So yes, this is a lot of fonts. And if we actually look at this in a waterfall graph, you can see that, so this is you can actually see over here that the JavaScript file started downloading and it said, whoops, we have a font. We're going to prioritize loading the font. And now you can have some JavaScript, right? And then when we start getting further down, you can see there's a whole bunch of images, and why are these images taking so long to download, right? When we scroll all the way down, right, you can see all the fonts that are downloading, right? So there's, these fonts are actually holding back a lot of the imagery, and imagery is, on an auto website, it's so important. There's other things that they can do here in terms of lazy loading, because they are loading a lot of images, probably a lot more than that's needed, but simply optimizing these fonts would make a huge impact on their web performance. Same deal. I can subset this. In this case, and now I'm including the two Korean characters, and I'm including the N with the tilde on top of it, and I've got a 10 kilobyte font file. So my 3 megabytes worth of content has now turned into 30 kilobytes. There's a tool called Font Drop where you can actually go and take a font file and just drop it onto the user interface, and it will actually show you similar. This is actually where I got in the inspiration for that periodic style table, where it will just show you like all of the glyphs, and there's like hover over that will show you the Unicode values. But it'll also show you things like the copyright and all the metadata in the font. It's really useful. But the point about subsetting is that like when you're supporting multiple languages, you can use multiple font files for the different languages. You don't need to load every character and deliver that for every user, especially with character sets that are very large. If you're rendering content in a Latin-based language, have 2 separate font files. Another topic I want to talk about is underutilized fonts. So here's an example of this is like a sports betting website. I've never heard of this, but apparently it's a really popular website. And they're loading a lot of fonts at the beginning of the page. There's actually a feature in Chrome DevTools. It's an experimental feature, which is why you see the little lab beaker there. But it's called CSS Overview, and there's a link here that shows you how to configure this in DevTools. It's really cool because it allows you to actually see like a whole lot of detail about your CSS on the page that was rendered already. And if I go to the font section, I can see all the different fonts that were loaded, and I can actually see the different occurrences of a font. And these are occurrences in terms of characters or like character blocks. But one of the things that you'll notice here is that Font Awesome 5 is used 24 times. And Font Awesome 5 was actually quite large. In this case, it was 75 kilobytes. When I click on that 24, I'm actually able to see a whole bunch of elements where that font is styled. And what I can see here is that it's being used to load the YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's actually just this section of the page, right? So that was 75 kilobytes. It was used to style 5 characters. So this is a perfect example of like where subsetting could help. They're also not compressed, and you'll find that on a lot of sites that it's not just one thing. Sometimes there's multiple performance issues. But so there's a bunch of TTF fonts that were not compressed. Some of them are icons, so they could just be compressed. Some of the ones that are not icons could probably be converted to WAF2. We've got this one here that we just looked at. There's 459 glyphs. 5 of them were used. Here's another one where there's 1,855 glyphs. 2 of them were used on the page. Right, these are just 2 icons out of and this is a larger Font Awesome library. Combining them, like subset them and combine them, I think would be a huge win for them. Later on in the page load, there were more fonts. There was an Ultimate Team Icons font where there's 32 kilobytes, 1 glyph was used. There was another one where there's 142 kilobytes containing 879 glyphs, 1 was used. And there's so many more, right? So this is just an example where not only do we have a lot of fonts that are unutilized, underutilized, but there's a lot of subsetting opportunities and even compression opportunities. And then there's some fonts that are not used at all, right? And so all of these fonts were preloaded. And these fonts are like not used on the web page at all, but were still loaded. We're actually going to talk about that a little bit in the preloading section. Right? Preloading is a really fantastic feature that allows you to tell the browser, load this content and load it like right away. Right? So fonts already have a high priority, but the fonts are going to be loaded when they're discovered. Right? So if I download my CSS and then I process, once the DOM is constructed and it realizes it needs the font, it's going to start downloading the font files. But I can say preload the fonts and it'll load even earlier. Preloading works really well when you have a small number of font files or when you have moderately sized fonts. Preloading fonts does not work well when you have numerous font requests, large font files, unnecessary font files, like ones that are just not used, or if you're using a performance technique called font display swap. Font display swap basically is saying render the system font and swap the styled fonts in place once it's available. And so if you're preloading the fonts and also telling the browser that you don't care when it loads the fonts, you're kind of saying run slowly or walk fast, right? Which is confusing, but there are sites that are doing this. So here's an example of UPS. So UPS is preloading 10 font files, right? And if I look at the tool that I wrote, I can see that this is 865 kilobytes of fonts that are loaded before the first contentful paint. This is half of the bytes that are loaded before the first contentful paints. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that Roboto Regular is being loaded as a WAF 2, and a TTF. And then Roboto Medium is loaded as a WAF 2, and a TTF. They're actually only using the WAF 2 when they're rendering the page. So the other ones are unused. And so this is resulting in like long delays in the page load time. You can see here in this example, it took like almost 2 seconds longer just because it was loading all these fonts. In this case, just eliminating the unneeded preloads would actually help a lot. I found this example. This is Microsoft.design. This is very font heavy. I think half of the page weight is fonts. And when I looked at this in the tool, I can see that there's like the one on the bottom here is a TTF font that is that? Okay, yeah, the TTF font is 2.2 meg. Now, this is actually compressed. It was 4 meg uncompressed. But it's got 16,000 glyphs in it. A bunch of the other fonts are a lot smaller in comparison, but there's a lot of them. And all of these fonts are using font display swap. So the TTF on this site is compressed. It contains a lot of fonts. The 14 WAF 2 files are preloaded. All of them have more glyphs than are needed. They're all like over 1,000 glyphs. Some of these fonts are used only to style a few characters. And then font display swap is used, so preloading on all of these fonts is kind of wasteful. Here's another example. This is Mayo Clinic. They preloaded 162 kilobytes worth of fonts. And then they loaded the same exact font files from a different domain name right afterwards. So they're actually preloaded. I think they preloaded the fonts, and then they loaded the CSS that referenced the fonts in the correct place, and then they loaded the correct fonts. So I showed you an example. Actually, in the example from my tool, it actually kind of points out, because Web Page Test captures this, but you can see like the fonts that were unused preloads. But in Chrome DevTools, if you wait like 3 seconds after the page loads, you'll actually see this, right? So load a page, wait 3 seconds, it'll actually show you any preloaded resource that was not used. In this case, you can see the 4 font files, and there was another resource that was not utilized. Next, third-party fonts. The short version of third-party fonts is, if you don't have to use them, don't use them. Right? You're always going to get better performance by hosting like your fonts yourself. And I'll show you an example from the HTTP archive. So during one of the first iterations of the HTTP archive, we had used Google Fonts. Now, we did pre-connect the Google Fonts. So this is a feature here that will establish the connection early, but we still had to, as you saw in my primitive example earlier, establish the connection to fonts.googleapis.com, download the CSS, and then download the fonts from a third party. We were actually able to speed up the site considerably by just hosting those fonts first party. Right? This is kind of the difference what it looks like in a film strip view. Right? It can be significant. Barry Pollard, Google, had written a fantastic article about how the decision-making process, both pro and con, of self-hosting Google Fonts. There are some advantages sometimes to having Google Fonts, but there are also some advantages to self-hosting them. One of the advantages that you can have when you're using Google Fonts, if you have to use a Google Font, is that Google Font has built-in font display swap. They have built-in subsetting. I can actually this last version here will actually just create 4 glyphs in a font file that just spell out hello. So if you just need to use it for a few characters, you can create a small font file. And I linked the Google documentation here. Another example of third-party fonts could be even a font that's loaded on a first-party domain. This is calendly.com, and the domain on line 9 is marketing-assets.calendly.com. So this is actually technically first-party content, but it's a subdomain. And because it's a subdomain, it's actually opening up another connection. And I think it would open up another connection regardless, but it might coalesce the connections depending on how the fonts are loaded if you're hosting it off of the primary domain. But in this case, the fonts are loading a little bit later. Web page test actually gives you the ability to experiment with fonts. So like you can experiment with self-hosting third-party fonts, pre-connecting third-party fonts, pre-loading third-party fonts. So this is all like if you use Web Page Test Pro, which is their subscription service, then you have the ability to go and run a bunch of these experiments without actually making any change to your site. Next thing I want to talk about is caching. There are really 3 rules for caching content, and we have quite a few CDN people here, so they probably know live and breathe this. But cache as much as you can, right? So whatever you can cache, you should cache that. You want to cache it as long as possible, right? How long can you cache that without it being served stale to a user? And then cache it as close to your users as possible, and that could mean a CDN, but it could also mean a browser, right? And when I look at cache control headers like this, where like this is caching for a year and saying the resource is immutable, meaning that it will never change, that's usually what I'd like to see with a font file. But sometimes I'll see something like this, cache control no store. That means don't cache it. Cache control max age 60, only cache this for 60 seconds. Or cache control for an hour, but revalidate it. All of those are going to cause excessive round trips. And for a font file is very static. You very rarely will change a font file. In fact, I don't think that the fonts that we've hosted on Etsy's website have been changed in a few years. So if we go back to the Calendly example, their fonts have a max age of 0 and an S max age of 2. So what this is actually saying is don't cache this on the browser, but cache it for 2 seconds on the CDN. That is, especially with considering how many fonts are being loaded, that's gonna cause a lot of back and forth. Another one is Patreon, right? So Patreon has a max age of 0 and must revalidate. So this is actually saying cache it for 0 seconds or always revalidate it. So it's cacheable, but it's immediately invalid, right? So you always want to cache these resources very long. They're not going to change frequently. I used a bunch of tools during this talk. They're all linked here. I'll post the slides later as well. But yeah, that's my talk.
Questions? Go ahead.
I have a question about your font subsetting tool.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought of taking that, or are there tools that do this, that take it so far as to actually do source code analysis and do what essentially would be tree shaking for the font clips?
There is a tool that...
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure.
For the recording, sorry.
Okay, so the question was, I created a tool that identifies opportunities for font subsetting. The question was, have I ever thought about creating a tool that could go and crawl a website and create a subsetted font? And I didn't do that, but I mentioned before that there's Zach Leatherman had written a bunch of font blog posts. He also wrote a tool called Glyphhanger. I'll add it to this deck when I post it, but Glyphhanger is actually a tool that will go and crawl a website, and it will go and create a subsetted font for you based on the website's contents. So I don't need to do that. He did it already. Mm-hmm.
So my question is regarding how would you productionize font performance as part of your pipeline? So a lot of websites, larger websites, they have external content managers.
Mm-hmm.
They will do all the promotional content. There will be a separate CMS that they can connect to.
Yeah.
And the website is just skeleton.
Right.
Is it possible that content, there's languages, and then there is content that is put in that does not have clips? If we shorten the fonts to just that specific set of clips, 108 clips, mm-hmm. Is it then possible for us to have a system where content is validated and then new font files are generated for that?
That's a really good question. So this was a question about, so for a content management system, if you create like a smaller subsetted font for a particular site, could you have a system in place that would subset a font based on kind of the evolution of that content? And I would, I don't know of anything that does that. Maybe the Glyph Hanger tool could do that if you operationalize that. But that's definitely, I think, a consideration that you'd need to have if your content changes that frequently, where you might need to do subsetting more often. I would subset not just by characters. Like I wouldn't say just use, like if there's 108 characters, subset to 108 glyphs. I would say if you see mostly Latin characters, then extended Latin characters should be your subset. But maybe don't use Cyrillic characters unless you're, unless you're serving content in a language that's Cyrillic.
So the reason why I have this question is because I recognize the Kia website.
Mm-hmm.
I know what kind of CMSs are used for that because the content is always externally managed.
Okay.
Which is one of the reasons why they preload the font with all of those glyphs in place.
Oh, okay.
So all 16,000 fonts are loaded, but it gives it to the CMS because the technical team is no longer involved.
Mm-hmm.
So they want the content managers to just look at it and the ability to publish content on demand.
Okay.
So one of the reasons why that
Yeah.
font exists, why the 2 MB4 file exists, is because everything happens at the same time, and there's too
Mhm.
many content managers and not enough engineers.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, some problems are not technical,
That's
they're
a-
organizational, right?
It's a good case for more engineers or more performance engineers.
But Paul, do you think solving the same problem could work when you define basically the first group of fonts of like primary content, then additional fonts, and they will just incrementally load if they're used, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
That can be done as well, right?
Yeah. And I've seen that as well with some sites where like if you change the language, it will load another font package. But this could also be a case where let's say, and I know you don't work for Kia, but let's say you work for Kia, you could go and make a case with the marketing team or whoever is provisioning these font files or working with the CMS to potentially change the way you're doing some things, because the user experience for a user that is loading these pages would be considerably better. Maybe even running a smaller A/B test to see whether that would have an impact on the user's browse time and bounce rates and things like that. I think that from a performance perspective, from a performance engineering perspective, sometimes we need to go and reach out to teams that might not have performance as top of mind and point out the performance issues and then get them to potentially entertain implementing more performance solutions and seeing whether that would actually benefit them.
Paul,
Mm-hmm.
actually amend a little bit. So Etsy doesn't really fit in this model because every one of their pages is important. However, what we found as CDNs is that in the vast majority of websites, there's an elliptical curve as to which pages are utilized versus not utilized. In other words, 95% of your requests are going to less than 10% of your pages. So what does that mean? That means you actually need to have two different visions here. You need to focus on not just the totalitarian web font package, but you need to focus on those primary pages like your default site page, maybe even your build of your products page. You need to focus on maybe the page prior to displaying your video content, which is usually a very cache static page. And when you build out the customized fonts for those pages, you will get the bang for the buck. You will get users and clients to retain on your site, even though other pages may have to build up that large, huge font package. Focus on those pages first, get that bang for the buck. That's what everybody's looking for. That's what web page test is all about. When you go to web page test, you really crawl your site. Everybody knows about web page test. Why? Because we focus on about 5 to 10 URLs. So think about it that way. Focus on shrinking down the fonts and customizing the fonts specifically for that small percentage of pages.
And by the way, Cyrillic version of the font is a very common example. Actually, two companies I worked at used the same example, right? Like when the user picks one of the languages that uses Cyrillic, that version of the font would be loaded, and it will not be loaded otherwise. It just happened to be that both companies use the same font company, right? The same fonts, right? And it was just déjà vu for me, right? But this is not as uncommon or hard to do, but you need to pay attention to your it might be that internationalization team just never thought of performance because they usually concentrate on translators rather than than web performance, right? And maybe
It's
it's
not
just
a
reaching.
first question. It's not a first priority question.
Mo- Most people don't like, and I've seen this over the years. Most people don't think of fonts as being something that is a loading performance issue. It's usually a rendering performance because fonts are usually blocked based on like text is usually blocked based on the style. But not a lot of people think about the weight of the fonts as well as the impact that weight can have on other resources. And that was one of the reasons why I put that like loading chart in the in that tool, was because I wanted to highlight how many bytes were actually in flight before the content was rendered, because you're in direct control of that, right? If you need all you really need is CSS fonts and HTML to start rendering content, and you don't even need the fonts if you font display swap them. But if you can get that content rendered very, very quickly, if your fonts are not like preventing you from loading those other resources, you can get content rendered very quickly.
We have two questions here.
Mhm.
So you said WOOF and WOOF2 are both compressed, and then the other ones that you mentioned, the TTF, OTF, and EOF,
Yep.
are not. It seems to me, and you also said that browsers basically support the WOOF and WOOF2.
Mhm.
So I know at our company, like we've been putting out all of them.
Yep.
And that seems to be a fairly common practice, I believe. Are you suggesting that we should not be doing that then?
The browser will. So the question was, so a lot of companies will support all font formats and will provide all font formats in the CSS. And the question was, should you not do that? I would say it's okay to support all of the font formats, but support WAF2. Right? Because like if you have a WAF2 and a WAF and a TTF in your CSS, the browser is going to choose the format that is best for that browser.
But don't they all have to get downloaded or not necessarily?
No.
They don't.
It's going to pick one and it's going to download it.
Unless you forcefully
That's right.
preload
Yeah.
them, as the polls example had, like that.
Yeah.
was-
That was a problem. The problem is preloading them.
Yeah.
I don't know how
The-
to manage that. Feel free to contact me because I can tell the browser
Yeah.
based on which user.
But yeah, it's
who's browsing, and if it's that old ass I-11, I should
Yeah. Years ago, I think there was a browser bug where like the order that it showed up in the CSS would affect which one was loaded, but I think that's been a solved problem.
Okay.
But you can have a TTF and a WAF and a WAF2 referenced in your CSS, and the browser, if it supports WAF2, is going to choose WAF2.
Got it.
Right.
Okay.
So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily strip any of that out, but and just to like comment on the compression. So a TTF stands for true type font, right? A WAF is a true type font that is gzip compressed. So the binary font file is actually gzip compressed. A WAF2 is broadly compressed true type fonts. Right, that's the only difference. They're all the same format. It's just the compression is built into the font format.
Icon fonts. It seems that they're getting less popular. Is that something that you've seen coming by looking at the statistics maybe? And second question, is a custom icon font a good home for my little vector graphics, or should I search another means?
So there was two questions. One was are icon fonts becoming less popular? And the other is, should vector graphics replace icon fonts? I don't know. I haven't done the research to see if icon fonts are becoming less popular. There may actually be a section in the Web Almanac about that. I'd have to go and check that chapter again. But if not, that would actually be a really interesting study and to see like how popular are icon fonts. I've seen a lot of icon fonts on the web, so like it feels like it's popular to me. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the answer to how popular.
Every other website had Font Awesome, for example.
Yeah.
I also do remember that I had a project where we rendered our own. So it was always a bit controversial. Some people said, yeah, that is great because everything's nicely compressed. And others said, there's other means of getting your SVGs out in the wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think depending on how many glyphs you need, like an SVG might be better, especially an inline SUV as well. Funny stories like that font tool. When I created the font tool, I took the lazy approach first, and I used Font Awesome. and the like
And some
literally.
of us pointed out.
Yeah, and I showed it off in one of the Meet for Speed sessions that we have, and like someone pointed out like, oh wow, 90% of your web page about fonts is fonts, right? And so I wound up subsetting the font, and now my Font Awesome font is 1 kilobyte, right? But like I probably could have replaced that with an SVG.
Is it better to replace that with SVG?
I don't know. Does anybody have thoughts?
I have an opinion. The answer is yes.
Yes.
Most likely, yes. Very rarely you have a lot of glyphs, right? A lot of icons, right? Sometimes you have 10, maybe 20 icons on the page, right? Like this is nothing comparing to the whole font, right? Comparing to the whole font. Moreover, icons are only rendered when font loads, which you might not want to have, right? Like you might actually want to render them right away. Inlining SVG font, SVG directly or using the use. I don't know if you're familiar with SVG use, where you inline only one SVG and then use it everywhere. If you repeat the icon and all that, is much better. Comes together with the HTML, together with text. It's kind of much faster. Obviously, it depends on how you make your SVG. You can put your megabyte SVG out there. That's not a problem. Sorry, there was one question over here. And then we'll go.
Basically, all the idea you present is can be applied to any kind of static content within the web page, right? For example, CSS and JavaScript as well. But I think the things I'm missing from your side is like we try to reduce the sizing of the font, but I did not see the correlation between reduced sizing and the loading time, because eventually it's the loading time matters, right? For example, you reduce from 200 kilobytes to 2 bytes, but you only reduce time from 1 millisecond to, I don't know. So I'm just curious how in the large pictures, right?
Yeah.
The whole page loading, right? Reduce sizing, how you translate that to the user.
Yeah, so the question was around like the larger picture of if fonts are often not the largest amount of weight on a page. If you're reducing the fonts even by a significant size, like you might be, and I'll just kind of like throw an example, but like let's say you have 3 megabyte homepage and maybe 200 kilobytes of font files. If you make those font files 10 kilobytes, you still have an almost 3 megabyte homepage, right? And I would say it depends on where the fonts are loading, right? If the fonts are loading in that critical stage where it's just before the page starts to render, then every byte counts at that stage because that's blocking everything else. So sure, that 2.8 meg of content is still going to be loading in the way that it's loading, and there might be other optimizations that we can do for that. But that 200 kilobytes would be a certain amount less blockage before the browser can process those other things.
I see, because that's in a critical text.
Yep, exactly.
And by the way, to add to that, not every static content has the same weight, right? Like for example, JavaScript is much more expensive per kilobyte than images, for example, right? Fonts, if they are blocking rendering, if they're not just a swap, they are effectively as problematic as CSS itself. How many of you have seen pages that load with no text on them? And then eventually text shows up. I'm like, why? Like, text is the first thing that arrives with HTML, right? Why couldn't you show it, right? And so the answer is never like that straightforward, like just reduce the kilobytes, but generally that's equivalent.
Could be 10, 20, 30 milliseconds between you and being number 1 or number 2.
Yeah, that's true. No, sorry, we have a question in the back.
Since we touch on the SVG, a lot of SVGs referencing fonts as well. Sometimes they reference CSS, which reference the font. The question is if from the page load perspective, if there is any difference if SVG referencing external fonts. That's question 1. And question 2, what about embedded fonts? We didn't touch on embedded fonts at all. Is there any benefits? I mean, I know benefit that no two Arials are the same when you load.
Right.
So embedded fonts obviously will give 100% representation.
Yeah.
But other than that,
So there's 2 questions there. One was in SVG you could call a font file. You could call an external font file, and I think that font file would be loaded with a high loading priority because of the request priorities in the browser. And then the second question is around. Actually, what was the second question?
About embedded.
About embedded fonts. Are you like referring to like inlining the fonts, like base 64 encoding and inlining fonts? Yeah. I would actually discourage that. The reason why I would discourage that is, especially, well, it depends if you're doing it. So, if you're doing it in your CSS, that might be okay. But if you're doing it for every font file, regardless of whether the font file is actually needed on the page, you might be over downloading.
CSS.
Yeah, for CSS. And if you're doing it in your HTML and your HTML is not cacheable, then you're going to be bloating up your HTML, and like essentially it's almost the same as delivering those font files multiple times.
Yeah, I would argue better convert them to SVG in that if you want to
Yeah.
embed, right? I thought immediately, like, what if your logo is in the font? And I'm like, why would you put the logo in the font, right? That's probably the only example where you would inline, but then just do SVG, and that would be much more neat.
I have seen that with some like payment providers.
So graphs usually rendering tools, they're building graphs and the wording around it, usually they're using the fonts,
Yeah.
but and there is a licensing issue usually, right? So,
Yeah.
around wasting it on your own side, and also right now they're also blocking. I'm not blocking. They're using the headers, which browser actually is not Google loaded. It's not from the same site.
Of course.
Yeah, course headers. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there are. That's why you not always can. I mean, even what you said, I'm not sure how much of it will be legal when you're building your own stuff. Like you said, you
Yeah.
have to contact the.
Yeah, you always need to check to see what's in your
So
license.
All of those who are trying to build the one font representation of all the glyphs as is, make sure you check your font license. But other than that, I think it's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, the licensing is definitely very important, especially if you're using a commercial font.
Are the vendors that more cooperative than others?
I don't know. I haven't worked with many font vendors, but the one that I worked with at my day job was very cooperative.
Okay, maybe you can tell me later which one it is.
I actually don't remember which one it was because I wasn't the one that talked to them. I just remember being given a much smaller font file than I was able to generate, and I was like, "Whoa, cool!"
They sound very friendly. Yes.
Yeah.
Good news is that that legal department in your organization is actually in your organization, right? They're not evil Martians from somewhere. You can talk to them. And moreover, marketing departments sometimes okay to pick a different vendor. Like vendor conversation doesn't have to be like, oh, they picked the vendor and they cannot do anything about it. You can work with the vendor, you can work against the vendor, and like say, well, sorry, like you cannot do that, right? And that's where third-party policies, well, fonts are a little weird that way because there is a little more legal in it than in other sources, but it's possible.
If you're paying your vendor and you tell them that something's important to you, they're probably going to listen.
Because the alternative is what?
Yeah.
Will they not take money because they didn't want to format the file properly? I don't know. Is that something?
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Thanks. I have like a multi-part question about font display swap. Does that have like a negative user experience impact? And I guess I've also noticed that like when you don't use a Google, even when a user you don't use it, sometimes you get a warning from Google that like your font hasn't loaded. Is this like a performance issue at all, or is it just something that Google doesn't want?
I don't know about the warning from Google. I do know, like, when you say warning from Google, is it a tool?
It's like if you ever I don't know if you've used Core Web Vitals, it's like a page speed and sensor from Google.
Okay, so the page speed insights tool.
Yeah, they like. I'm selfishly asking a question about my side.
That's fine. Go ahead.
But yeah, we get like a warning from I'm in the media business, so they take this very seriously. And we get a warning that says, "Hey, ensure web font is loaded before rendering the page," or something like that. And I think it's because like we don't use font display swap, and so they give us this warning like, "Hey, please use it." But then when we use it, we still get it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But anyways, yeah, that was
Yeah, I think that there's definitely been discussion, and I'm not as certain I'm as up to date on it to comment, but there's been a lot of discussion about whether font display swap is beneficial or harmful. I know that there's some talk a while ago about whether it causes cumulative layout shifts because if you have if your system font is vastly different from your custom fonts, and you use font display swap, you might actually cause layout shifts on the page, and that's going to be really bad for Core Web Vitals. So that might be a case where the tool like PageSpeed Insights might say you're using this feature and it's actually hurting performance because it's causing the layout shift. But there are ways of tweaking your system fonts so that the system font kind of fits within the bounds of the layout that you're creating. I have to dig up the tool that there's a tool that a Google engineer had written that had allowed you to take your custom web font and a system font and basically tune a bunch of CSS sliders to to basically line up your text, and once your text is lined up, you know exactly what you need to do in order to kind of preserve that have that system font that would be really, really close. Yeah.
And by the way, at that very moment, you can also ask yourself, do you need a custom font if you manage to do that in a system font?
Right.
One of the things early in my talk, I when I kind of go all the way back to the top of this, and this is something that I've been thinking about as I was doing this, is the most popular sites are using less percentage of custom web fonts, right? So that is a really interesting technical observation there, is that there's 27% of top 1,000 websites that are not using custom web fonts. Maybe the system fonts are actually giving them a good enough experience and a consistent enough experience where they don't have to incur the performance cost of that.
And by the way, this kind of example of swap and tuning that is what we talk about at Need for Speed School. Sometimes deep dive so much that it's crazy. Paul likes to do that. So if you wanna ask a question about your specific business, feel free to join.
Yeah, no, I mean it wasn't a huge thing that we were focusing on, performance wise, but it was we did do a little research, and we didn't do anything. Actually, and I thought we used way too many fonts, but looking at other people's websites, I'm all right, no.
Don't take those 712 fonts.
We actually feel pretty good now, so I'm not worried anymore.
Those 50 are good.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, in your first page, you showed the Etsy page where you looked at it and why it was a problem. So why didn't you embed it as the text within the images? Because I understand the fonts that are for the text purposes, right, on the page, right? But in your case, it's actually pure visual.
Mm-hmm.
You could have have it as part of the image. Why you decided to go all this route with clips and stuff like that and reducing, while you could have embedded from Cloudinary get even different sizes of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
SEO, is there any SEO value?
Accessibility, SEO. SEO, I don't know, but accessibility for sure.
But if you look at, so our largest contentful paint element on this particular page was actually the text block, right? And if you look at when largest contentful paint was fired here, it was actually before any images were loaded.
No, just joking.
Yeah.
Making an
You
image.
can make an image.
Think about it as a progressive enhancement. I don't know if it was implemented that way, but if you think about, imagine the image in the background didn't load and it was just CSS background, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it would have been usable if it was coded properly with just text, right? So sometimes images are not the best answer. We have a couple questions. One here.
Mm-hmm.
Now
I
5
just
more
wanted
questions.
to comment. It's probably too much of a lift to change it. We support a lot of different languages on Etsy, and we have translation, so it probably would be annoying to have 20 different versions of this image in all the different languages.
Oh yeah, that's
Okay.
as well.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in the caching section, you had one of the examples that had max age 0 and revalidate. Does that mean that it's not caching at all?
No, it's actually caching.
Okay.
So max age 0 means that it's cacheable. So max age 0 means that it can be cached. It will be cached on the disk. It will just immediately be invalid. Now the browser will send a conditional request and say if modified since, and if the response has not been modified since, the server will come back and say 3 or 4 unmodified. Right. So
with only the headers sent back. That's
Yeah.
That's the difference.
So this is better than a no store, but it's still an unnecessary round trip.
Okay. So it saves the download time on
I'm sorry?
It only saves the download time.
Yeah, it saves the download time if it hasn't been changed.
Question?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So the font stop setting technique you were using, does it also apply to variable fonts?
Good question. I don't know. I haven't played around with variable fonts.
I think
as
it
much.
does in general because the properties are specific to the glyph, right? Like
Yeah.
how do we call them? I forgot the name of the actual things you could change in them, right? But they are for each glyph, right? So
Yeah, the tool that I used is the tool that I used is called Font Tools. So it's possible that Font Tools has support for variable fonts in it.
I know they're already like smaller than traditional like all the fonts with different font weights, but I would be curious if we can even make it smaller.
Yeah, so it does look like Font Tools has support for variable fonts in it. I haven't personally worked with variable fonts yet.
Thanks.
Is that as small as it
Any
looks
more
on my screen?
questions?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I was curious about the font swap because we use preload with link headers, so that way the fonts are shoved through, and we only have a few of them, keep it minimal. And yes, Glyphhanger, we use it, it's great, so
Cool.
I recommend it. But yeah, we do use almost 90% we use, now I have to double check, but we use font swap because we want to get that perceived load time. And if the fonts are really close, again, the CLS is kind of minimal. But I was curious if you looked into that and you saw, or I guess if you could say more about, yeah, I know you already asked about font swap, but if you know a bit more or kind of about the gotcha there, because I'm not sure I followed that.
So the gotcha about font display swap and preloads is if you're loading a large amount of font bytes. So if you're loading a large amount of font bytes and you don't care when that font actually renders, then don't preload it. But if let's say you're preloading like 3 font files and it's a really small amount of font weight, that's probably not a big deal. It really all comes down to how much content are you shoving down the pipe before the browser can download the things it needs to render the page. And if it's excessive, then and you're preloading and also telling the browser that you don't need the font right away, then don't preload it. Another technique that I've seen used as well is if you there's a feature called early hints. And early hints you can actually use to preload a resource before the HTML is done generating.
Yeah, we found early hints to be, it's still deferred to the browser, so early hints was not as good as some of the other strategies. But I don't know, maybe other people have more success with it.
Yeah, I've done early hints with fonts. I haven't measured like a clear like win in terms of like performance for early hints. So the jury's still kind of out for us on early hints. And for us, like it's not supported universally across our stack yet, but it's definitely something that I've been interested in, and primarily from a font loading perspective. Because like if we can, and I think if I go back to the example where I was showing the Etsy page load, where are we? So if I can preload some of these font bytes during this time to first byte, right, then like that's time that's otherwise spent idle. So like I like the concept of early hints. We were able to implement it and test it. We didn't see as much of a performance boost as I was expecting though.
But in terms of like, do we need font survey or not? Basically, think of, do they compete with my own CSS that blocks the rest of the rendering or not? That's kind of what I always think of. And sometimes also the LCP image, like, do they compete with my LCP image, which is like, I optimize as much as I could, right? And we actually had a great example at the last Meet for Speed where the image was delayed because fonts were prioritized. Right, like you could see some bytes flying in, like Paul's example with JavaScript. I forgot what Visual Source Paul mentioned. That some bytes would arrive, then the fonts will take over the pipe, and then the rest of the bytes would arrive. Right, and you could reproduce it multiple times. I was like, wow, this is like clear example where you want to like do your due diligence here, clearly hurting you loading that many fonts. And in that case, it wasn't the most important font. I mean, we didn't go that far yet in optimization, but it was a clear example.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.